Okay, so today is the second of this four-part series in Buddhism in a nutshell, where we cover all of Buddhism. And last time I gave some general observations about Buddhism. And this time I'm going to start getting into the nitty-gritty from here on out all the way. And so today in particular, I'm going to start by talking about the life's, the biography of Buddha, who Buddha was, and then launch into the history of Buddhism. And after that, we'll start plunging into the doctrine, the Four Noble Truths, which is the fundamental doctrine. Everybody, all Buddhists agree that's the thing underlying all of Buddhism. And before I begin, though, just coming back to what we were talking a little bit about last week, I mean, the one thing I would say is that there is this reaction that you sort of shared last week that, you know, people get very uptight about Buddhism. You know, am I practicing right? You know, am I going to end up in the hell realms for 50 billion eons because I forgot to do this one little tiny thing? And, you know, people often get really uptight about a lot of these various things. And I think that the thing to remember is that the Buddha himself was extremely practical. And he would run around and he kept telling people, basically, do what works. And his mantra was always, to a certain extent, you know, is this wholesome? Is what you're doing making you a better person? Is it working? And if it is, keep doing more. And if it's not, stop doing it. You know, and that's the way Buddha always was. It was always practical. You know, look at what you're doing, see how it's working, what effect it's having on you, and adjust, because we're all different and we all need different things. And there's even some people who really Buddhism doesn't work for. You know, everybody has their own karmic connections or whatever, and they have their own path, and people are at different places on the spiritual path. And there are certain people that, for where they are in the present moment, Buddhism doesn't work for them. And sometimes, Catholicism, Islam, Judaism, some other religion sometimes is better for them for where they are. And what we say in Buddhism is that if some other religion works better for you and improves your spiritual life, makes you a better person and works better for you than Buddhism, then you should really do that other religion, because that's the whole point. The whole point of Buddhism is to be helpful. And if it's not helpful, then, you know, you may not have the right karma for it or whatever. So Buddhism is in a sense very relaxed. And there are some people who actually have practiced two religions simultaneously. They practice their own religion, and then they use whatever they learn from Buddhism to actually help them in whatever, you know, specific practices sometimes can help them with their anger or helps them in some way to be more relaxed or a better person, or maybe they like the meditation practice or whatever. So, and the other thing too is that another real strong principle of Buddhism, which I think is really helpful to get, and I think makes you relax a little bit, is that Buddhism is all about causes and condition. Nothing happens randomly. Everything happens because the right causes and conditions are there to make it happen that way. And when you think, but it goes a little bit deeper than that, because the thing they don't realize is the other thing that's true is there's not one cause or condition. There's always many causes and conditions. You know, whatever's happening to you at this very moment isn't because of just one thing, but it's probably because 50, 100 things have all come together to bring you into the current situation that you're in. So once you realize that in terms of your practice, what it's really saying is, you know, there's not a single practice that's going to make you enlightened. You have to do lots of different things to make yourself enlightened. So don't get so uptight about it. You know, it's like doing one thing or not one thing, isn't that important. What's really important is that you have a good heart, that you're trying to make yourself a better person. And, you know, and again, of course, you don't want to do anything, you don't want to create negative karma, which means basically you don't want to harm yourself or others. But aside from that, you know, it's like you have to find your own path through. And we often have very, amazing teachers who can inspire us and so forth. And if you resonate with one particular teacher, then stick with that teacher and follow what that one particular teacher says. But you don't have to do that. You should really make sure that whatever you're doing is working for you. And like I say, if it's not working for you, change. And I think that's what Buddha would tell you to do. And I think that's the reason why when I'll mention again, when Buddha died, he didn't appoint a Pope of Buddhism, because there's not one person who's going to tell you exactly what to do. So Buddha is sort of, the way to think about it is Buddhism is like this wide river that's flowing along. And that's also the way you should practice. You should practice slow, steady progress, where you just try to improve yourself little by little. Work on this practice, make this better, work on that practice, make that better. It's not like a waterfall where you suddenly leap off. And there are people who treat it like a waterfall. I mean, they go all out, and then they burn out very quickly, and then they stop. And whereas Buddhism is meant to be like this gently flowing river where you just keep moving along. And in my own mind, and I've heard other people say this too, the most important thing in Buddhism is just persist, keep going. It's like you got to think of Buddhism for the long term. And in my mind, if you're doing the best you can, trying to practice whatever seems to work best for you, you don't have to worry. It's like you're creating good karma, and from that good karma, other good karma will arise. And so again, I think people, when they start, the teacher tells them to do this thing, and they're terrified whether they're doing it right or wrong. And there's even examples in Buddhism. There's a famous example of an old woman who was starving to death. Somebody gave her a mantra which enabled her to convert stones into edible food. She said that mantra, it saved her from starving to death. And then one of her relatives came by, who was a monk, and discovered she was saying the mantra incorrectly, corrected the mantra, and then she lost her faith in the mantra, and she got so confused that it never worked again. But that was the point. The fact was the original mantra was being said incorrectly, but because she had the right intention, it worked. And since karma, as we'll talk about, is intention, karma is basically intention, the important thing is just to have the right intention. And so focus on that, focus on being beneficial to people, non-harming and so forth. And then the rest, don't worry. You don't need to get uptight. So let's talk about the life story of Buddha. So Buddha lived, well, we don't exactly know exactly when he lived, but in round numbers, I always go by 500 BC. There's some people who said he lived a little earlier, some people who said he lived a little later. And in fact, we'll probably never know. And the reason we'll never know is nothing to do with Buddhism. It's just that in ancient India, they didn't care that much about dates, and they didn't record things very carefully. And so what's true of when Buddha was born and stuff is the same problem with all of the history of ancient India. A lot of these dates are uncertain just because it was just something they didn't think was all that important. So, but anyway, I think 500 BC is a good round number. And so we can think of Buddha's living roughly 2,500 years ago. Okay, so what was it like when Buddha was alive? When Buddha was alive, he grew up in northern India. Some people dispute whether it's actually even some parts of where he was Nepal. In fact, it was so far north. But basically, sort of around southern Nepal, northern India was sort of the main area that he lived. And at that time, the political structure of ancient India was just lots of little kingdoms. And it was almost like medieval Europe. You had these little kingdoms, and they would all fight against each other. And sometimes you'd have the smaller kingdoms being vassals of some of the bigger kingdoms and so on. So it was that sort of behavior. And we think that the place, Sakya was the name of the place, the kingdom or country that Buddha came from. So that's where we have Buddha Shakyamuni. So Shakya is his clan name. And we're not sure. I mean, some people think that was a kingdom and that his father was the king of that kingdom. Some people think it was a republic and his father was voted king. But nonetheless, any way you look at it, his father was the ruler of that kingdom. Okay, so when Buddha was born, there was, I mean, in Buddha's life, of course, there's a lot of things about miracles and auspicious things, and, you know, like all religions. But I think one thing is, so we're just going to focus on the things that are important for the practice. But one thing that was important just before Buddha was born, they consulted some sort of soothsayer, you know, some sort of guy who could sort of look into the future and sort of predict what was going to happen. And they asked about this birth because there were a lot of auspicious signs when Buddha was born. His mother had these dreams of a white elephant with 6 tucks, and there were all sorts of things. And so they were very curious about who this person was going to be born. And so this soothsayer basically said, he predicted that Buddha indeed, that this was a very auspicious birth, and that you know, a great being was going to be born to them. And what he said next was really the interesting part. He said, this can go 2 ways. One way it can go is this son that's going to be born to you can become a Chakravartin king, one of these great kings who rules by the nature of his justice, but basically takes over the whole world, will end up ruling the whole world. You know, like not just a minor king, but a great king. So that's one way it can go. The other way that it could go is the son that's going to be born to you will become a great religious leader. So that's important because it affected Buddha's childhood and early adulthood, because his father naturally thought, I want him to become the Chakravartin king. I want my son, I don't want some stupid religious leader. I want my son to be this great, you know, king. And so for that purpose, when Buddha was brought up, his father did everything he could to attract him to the sensual aspects of life and to avoid sort of religious aspects. So Buddha was brought up in this extreme luxury. He had 3 different palaces for the 3 different seasons of what went on in India then. And he had, and his palaces were all staffed with beautiful women, and you know, and so essentially his father did everything he could to sort of encourage him to become a great king. And for the most part, Buddha grew up, and so Buddha had this very idyllic childhood. He lived in great luxury. Of course, he must have had the best education you can get and so forth. And he grew up. And then eventually, he actually did marry. So I should give some of the names. It's useful to know that. So his father was King Shuddhadana, and his mother was Queen Maya, sometimes Maya Devi. Devi means God in Sanskrit. And he eventually got married when he was a young man to a woman named Yasodhara. And he even had one child, a male child called Rahula. And about the time when he had his first child, we have this event which is usually given the name of 3 messengers. It said that 3 messengers came to Buddha. And what this meant is I think the messengers you can think of as almost spiritual realizations, that somehow the Buddha got curious about the outside world. His father had done everything he could to isolate the Buddha. And Buddha, by the way, also he sometimes was called Siddhartha, Prince Siddhartha. And after his full name is Buddha Shakyamuni. And Shakya is again this clan name, but anyway, he was probably known as Prince Siddhartha at the time. So at that time, his father isolated him from the external world because he was afraid that he might get some kind of religious influence and flip over to become a great religious leader. So, but anyway, at some point, just around the time that his first son was being born, he got curious about the outside world, and he escaped with one of his servants, and he was wandering around, and you had the first messenger, which was he saw a very sick person in the streets. And it occurred to him, oh, I could become sick also. And this is really terrible. It's really terrible that people can become sick and go through this kind of pain. And then a second time he escaped, and he saw an old person. And the same thing happened. He started thinking about that and saying, well, I can become old, and that's going to be terrible. Everybody becomes old, and that's really not acceptable. I really hate that idea. And then finally, the third messenger was he wandered around and he found a dead person in the streets, maybe being cremated or whatever. He saw someone who had died. And then it really hit him about death and the fact that he also could be dead. And so in terms of the spiritual journey, I think the important thing is that this is the great theme, as we'll see in the Four Noble Truths. For Buddha, it was the suffering of human beings was unacceptable. And his life mission became to find a way to overcome the suffering of human life. And so these three messengers play exactly into this future goal that he's going to have and succeed at. Sometimes it's said there's a fourth messenger, which he saw a religious person, which gave him the idea of turning toward the religious life. The details are a little bit vague, but nonetheless, shortly after his first son was born, he decided that he couldn't stand this anymore and he had to do something about it. And he decided that actually he would become a religious person. So much for his father's hopes. But anyway, and so he left home, he shaved off his beard and hair, put on ascetic clothing, and went wandering in the forests. So the other useful background thing of it is that, what was the religious background in India at that time? Well, from ancient times, the main religious path in India were the Vedas. And the Vedas had religious priests called Brahmins, which were the highest class. They believed in a caste system. The Buddha actually was not a Brahmin. He belonged to what was known as the warrior class. Warriors usually were the kings and rulers because they had to lead armies to do all these battles that these little kingdoms were always finding. And then you had a class of merchants, and then you had the untouchables, the people that hauled the garbage and did the things that were terrible. And this was a very class system. It wasn't quite as extreme as it is today, or has been recently, but anyway, it was a class system. In today's world, and for, I don't know, maybe 1,000 years or more, the Brahmins are really the dominant type. But at the time of Buddha, the warrior class and the Brahmins were somewhat more equal in terms of their caste hierarchy or whatever. And the other thing that happened, so these Vedas were basically a religion of sacrifice. And the Brahmin priests believed that these sacrifices were critical. And in fact, every prayer that you said in these sacrifices had to be done exactly right. And they were sort of saving the world by doing these sacrifices. So these animal sacrifices are very similar to ancient Greece and Rome. And it's no accident that they are, because actually the original Brahmins came from somewhere, maybe the steppes of Russia, somewhere up there. And a group of them came down to India, a group of them came down to Greece, and in both cases, they conquered the indigenous people. And so in India, they became the Brahmins, the highest class, because they were the conquerors. And they carried this animal sacrifice religion with them. And in Greece, it was the same thing. They conquered the indigenous people, and those were the Achaeans and the people that led to Homer and the Greek civilization. And so actually the ancient Greek language has a lot of linguistic similarities to Sanskrit, the language of the Brahmins, because they both came from Proto-Indo-European, the original language, when they were up in the steppes of Russia or above the Black Sea, somewhere around there. So anyway, so you had this Brahmin priest class, but in addition, the other religious element at that time is you had, I think they were called samanyas. They were wandering religious people. So you had these people who would just wander through the forest, and they would give teachings in towns and beg for alms, and they survived off of the alms of the village that the village people would give them. And it was considered to be, for the village people, it was considered to create good karma and so forth. The Hindus also had a notion of karma. So it was considered to be a good thing to support these religious people. And these religious people were wild. Some of them went naked. Some of them pretended they were dogs. Some of them were philosophers. Some of them were very superstitious people, religious followers. They were just all over the map in terms of religion. But they would live in the forests, and they would just wander around and beg for their food, clothing, and medicine. And so essentially the Buddha joined this class of people when he left his home. And so when he, and I should just say one more thing. I mean, it always struck me and many other people sort of callous the way he left his young wife and newborn kid. But the end result was actually good, because both his wife and Rahula actually became enlightened. They actually became Buddhists and became enlightened, so they had a good end. And it's an odd thing too. I mean, eventually, when the Buddha was older in life, his original clan insulted and their overlords, and the overlords came and actually slaughtered almost the entire clan that the Buddha came from. And so actually all the people in Buddha's clan, his cousins, son, wife, other people that joined him actually weren't slaughtered because they had followed Buddha. So it's another interesting little twist. But anyway, that's going too far afield to get into all of that. But at any rate, so when Buddha first left, what did he do? Well, he thought he should get a teacher, because, he'd never been an ascetic before. He didn't know what he was doing. So he found a religious follower who taught him very deep form of meditation. Later on, these meditations were called jhanas in Pali and dhyanas in Sanskrit. And I'll mention Pali is basically a vernacular language the local people talk. And Sanskrit was the language of the Brahmins, and it ultimately became the language of intellectuals in later times in India. But at any rate, Buddha learned some very deep meditation techniques from his first teacher. And eventually he thought, this teacher is teaching me, but, I'm a young guy, I'm strong, I've got a lot of energy. Whatever the teacher did, I should be able to do the same thing. And so he applied himself diligently to this meditation. And eventually he achieved the same spiritual level as his teacher. And at that point, his teacher picked up on that and said, oh, well, we're sort of at the same level here. So, you should co-lead the spiritual group with me. But at that point, the Buddha said, going back to this original quest, I've achieved the same level as you have, but I haven't achieved my quest. I still am going to get sick, age, die, and I haven't solved this problem of how to prevent that. And he said, so the Buddha said, I've learned everything I can learn here. So he left and he went to try to find somebody who could help him further along the way. And he did find somebody who was an even more advanced meditator, and he even took him up to sort of actually the highest level of meditation that you can get, that's in what we call the mundane path, that's not enlightened. So the highest sort of meditation you can do without becoming enlightened. The Buddha learned that. And again, the same thing happened. He said, oh, my teacher knows this. Why can't I do it? And he accomplished it. But at that point, he said and at this point, this leader was really impressed and said, oh, I'm going to follow you. You should lead the spiritual thing. But at this point, again, the Buddha said, I still haven't solved my problem. So I'm still I'm still going to get sick, age, die, and this is not satisfactory. There's got to be a way to prevent all of this human suffering. And so at that point, the Buddha then found a group of 5 other ascetics, and they wandered around in the forest practicing extreme asceticism. For the time frame for this, Buddha left home around the age of 29, and he became the Buddha at the age of 35. So he basically had 6 years of wandering as an ascetic for this whole period as an ascetic. And in this period, he went to extreme lengths. I mean, it was like he's saying, like, I was eating like 1 grain of rice a week. And, it's like he said all his bones were sticking out, his hair was falling out. And this was actually, this period, the Buddha actually, we know about this because the Buddha talked about it later on. He actually told what happened to him in this period. And so the Buddha actually came very close to death. And he was so Buddha went to extreme lengths trying to find the solution to how to solve, getting rid of illness, old age, and death. And all of this extreme asceticism just didn't work. He couldn't go any further. And then one day, he remembered when he was a young guy, when he was a kid, and he had been just watching his father do some religious ceremonies in some fields. And he had been quietly meditating, and he had noticed how blissful it was. And this is when he came to this notion of what he calls the middle way. So this middle way is really, really important in Buddhism. So this middle way is something, I think, that permeates all the Buddhist path. So it means not being extreme in any direction. So the spiritual path in the Buddhist way of doing things is always somewhere in the middle. So in terms of the Buddha's original life history, one extreme was the huge extreme luxury he had when he was living in all of his different palaces. The other extreme was this extreme asceticism when he was starving himself to death. And the Buddha said neither of these things work. What really works is the middle way. And so at that point, he gave up the extreme asceticism. There's different stories about how supposedly some young woman helped nurse him back to health, fed him, and so forth. And he grew strong enough. And when he grew strong enough, he sat down. That's when he sat down under the Bodhi tree and did these deep meditations where he achieved full enlightenment. And that's when he became the Buddha. And this happened when he was around the age of 35. And then from that point on, there's some mysticism about originally he said, well, I now see, what you have to do to become enlightened. And he thought it was going to become too difficult to teach other people, but some of the people in the God realm, particularly Brahma, convinced him to teach. So there's various things, but the end result is from that time forward, after achieving full enlightenment, for the rest of his life, which was he lived to about the age of 80. So basically it was roughly 45 years. So he had 45 years of teaching from that point onward until eventually he died. And for the rest of his life, he went around. The first thing he did is he went to these 5 people who he'd been ascetics for, and he originally taught them, and they achieved enlightenment. And then he continued teaching for 45 years. And then when he died, just before he died, as I said, I think there's 2 important things that happened just before he died. One is that all of his followers said, we're going to be devastated when you're going to die. Who's going to lead us? Who's going to give us our teachings? What are you going to do? And the Buddha refused to appoint a Pope of Buddhism. He said, I've given you the teachings, follow those. And supposedly in the Sutras, it says he said something like that his followers should be either an island or a lamp unto themselves. And the word in Pali is Deepa. Sanskrit, it would be similar to Deepa. But anyway, this word, both in Sanskrit and Pali, has this dual meaning of either island or lamp. And Buddha was extremely good with words. So I have the feeling that he deliberately uses word meaning both, meaning, you should be your own lamp, you should be your own teacher. And you should being an island means that you're responsible for your own spiritual path, which isn't to mean that you shouldn't get teachers. And in fact, the Buddha at various points recommended getting teachers. But ultimately, in Buddhism, the bottom line is you're responsible for your own spiritual life. And so you have to develop yourself. And there are reasons for this. Again, we'll talk more deeply about it. And ultimately, the bottom line is that to become enlightened, you have to sort of perfect your own mind. You have to change your own mind and remove all of the negativities in your mind and perfect it. And since it's your mind, you're the only person that can do that. So Buddha or no spiritual leader can come and give you a blessing and make you enlightened. You have to achieve your own enlightenment. You certainly can use your teachers to help show you the way, but it's up to you. The teachers can in fact, the Buddha used to say this. The Buddha would say, I point out the way to you. If you do exactly what I did, you will become enlightened. So I can point out the way to you, but it's up to you to actually practice that way and enlighten yourself. And so I think that's also, that's another thing that comes out of this sort of biography that's very useful. Okay, so that's in a very nutshell, the main thing about what the Buddha, a lot of it we don't know so much about the life of Buddha because we mainly know what he sort of talked about. Although there is an oral tradition, which I will come to. But before I get to that, the other thing too I want to talk about is how do we know all these things? Where does this come from? So I will talk about that. But before doing that, I think it's helpful to just give the follow-up history. What happens after Buddha died? So what happened after Buddha died is immediately all of the monks got together and they created actually the Buddhist scriptures. They got together and they recited, they brought all the people together who could remember every single thing that the Buddha had taught. And they created an oral tradition of the original texts, which were all oral. And these traditional texts fall into three groups. So one was called the Sutra or the discourses. And so this is a record of basically all the teachings that Buddha gave. So Buddha would go, at this time, he would go and he would give this teaching to this person or this group of people, and somebody would remember what he said, what that teaching was. And so that would be one sutra. And then he would go to some other group of people and he would give a different teaching and people would remember exactly what he said. That was another teaching. And so the discourses, and sometimes these discourses also include teachings by some of the senior monks. And sometimes you'll get a discourse where the Buddha will give some very brief teaching to some of the younger monks, and then the Buddha will go away to meditate, and the younger monks will turn to one of the senior monks and say, what the hell did he say? I have no idea what he was talking about. And then the senior monk will explain in detail, sort of expand the thing out so that the younger monks can understand. And then usually what happens, the Buddha comes back and everybody asks him, this is what the senior monk said, was this right? And the Buddha always says, yep, he said it exactly as I would have said it if I had been here. And the other traditional thing that happens is before the elder monk starts talking, he always saying, what's wrong with you guys? The Buddha was here just a second ago. Why didn't you ask him? You know, he's the source of all of this. Why are you asking me? But of course, the young monks, I think, were too, you know, everybody's always afraid of a great religious teacher, and they were probably overawed. So that's why they asked but some of the teachings in these sutras are also these things. So they were actually, and sometimes it's just one elder monk talking to another that illustrates some important point of the teachings. But most of it is what Buddha said himself. And you can wonder, you know, and so there are like at least four thick volumes, actually four main thick volumes of about this thick in English translation. And there's actually other collections that even go beyond that. So, well, you can imagine in 45 years, the Buddha gave a lot of teachings. And you can wonder, how did they remember all of this? But actually, the India that Buddha lived was an oral society. And the same thing that was happening to Buddhism was also happening to the Vedas. All the Vedas were passed down in an oral tradition. And in fact, in ancient India, they had elaborate means of memorization. You know, they would memorize the Vedas, and then first they'd memorize it straightforward. Then they would skip every other word. They'd recite the Vedas backwards every other, you know, they had all these elaborate ways of making sure that not a single syllable would be forgotten. And so Buddhism, so people in ancient times were extremely good at memorization and remembering things. A modern example that I ran across is quite interesting. I ran across a TV show about, apparently every year in Islam, there's a contest for young boys, sometimes as young as 8 years old, where they have to memorize the Quran. But memorizing the Quran means not only remembering every single word, but you also have to pronounce it in a very special way. There's certain words that you have to go sort of rise up on your tongue or fall down. So it's this whole elaborate thing to memorize this huge Quran. And then they have a contest for who can do it the best. And if you do it, you win this great prize. It's very prestigious. And so huge numbers of young boys all throughout the lands of Islam participate this, and it's a very big thing, and they can do it. So even kids as young as 8 years old can memorize the entire Quran, including all of these elaborations of precise pronunciation, maybe even gestures, I don't know what. But what's even more remarkable is that many of these young kids memorizing the Quran don't speak Arabic. So essentially, they're just memorizing what's to them is just gobbledygook. So if young kids 8 years old can do that today, you know, you can imagine how it would be possible to memorize all these things and keep it exactly correct, even way back then. So that's one group of scriptures, is the sutras. The second group is what's called the Vinaya. And these are the rules for the monks. And these rules occurred because when Buddha was alive, the monks kept screwing up and fighting amongst themselves and getting into trouble. And they would always come to Buddha with, you know, this guy's fighting with this guy. What are we going to do about this? And so the Buddha would make some rule that would help the monastic community live better in harmony. And this is what eventually the Vinaya became. It became the collection of all of these rules. And so the remarkable thing about the Vinaya, however, is that it's just not a collection of rules, but in the Vinaya, they actually give the original incident that created the rule. So in the Vinaya, you're told, you know, this is the rule you have to follow. But the reason you have to follow this rule is because of this incident. These people were fighting, and this is what happened to them, and this is why we made this rule. And in fact, at the time when Buddha, just before Buddha died, the Buddha actually casually mentioned to his senior monks, oh, by the way, you know, it's like we shouldn't get too uptight about this. If you want to, after I'm dead, you can sort of throw out some of the more minor rules and, you know, simplify things a little bit. And however, after Buddha died, and actually the Buddha told this to Ananda, and after he died and they were trying to, you know, recreate all of these things, the oral tradition, they asked Ananda, well, which ones are the minor rules? And Ananda says, oh, you know, I didn't think about to ask him about that. And then they were so terrified, and then they were worried, how are we going to know what's a minor rule and what's a major rule? So they ended up not throwing out any rules because they couldn't figure out they didn't know which ones were minor or not. But they were really mad at Ananda for not asking them. So anyways, so that's the second group, is these monastic rules. The third group is called the Abhidharma. And the Abhidharma, Abhi sort of means that you can translate these things different, but Dharma basically means the Buddhist teaching. Dharma actually has many different meanings. It can have philosophical meanings, but the main meaning that's usually given is it just means the Buddhist teachings. And the Abhi means the higher teachings. And so the Abhidharma originally grew up, got started when the Buddha was alive, actually. And there are things called matrices, which are the word Sanskrit for matrix. But basically, when Buddha was alive, a lot of the teachings he would give, he would often number things. He would say, oh, there's 4 things you need to know about this. Number 1 is this, number 2 is this, number 3 is this, number 4 is this. And I think the Buddha was doing this because it was an oral society, and it helps to have numbered lists to remember things. And so then when, especially when the Buddhism grew and you started having thousands of monks, and the Buddha couldn't individually teach everybody, the older monks would usually give the younger monks, the newer monks, teachings. And then when they would do this, they would say, oh, well, the Buddha said you had to have know these 4 things about this. And they would, rattle them off. And then the young novice monks would memorize them. And so that was the origin of what most people think is this Abhidharma. And eventually what it became is it became a full-blown, basically the philosophy of Buddhism. And what distinguishes the Abhidharma from the Sutras, so both of them are supposed to be the teachings of the Buddha, but the Sutras were basically always done in a very specific environment. The Buddha was talking to these people, and the Buddha said, there's a whole thing in Buddhism about skillful means. You always need to teach people what they need to know. And the Buddha, again, could read people's minds, so he would know what the people were in front of him. So the Buddha always would tailor his teachings to what those specific people needed to know. And so when he did that, if you just went through all of the sutras, they were just like this hodgepodge of millions of different teachings, and they weren't organized in any way. It's like when the Buddha saw this group of people, he taught them this, and when he saw this group of people, he taught them that. And that's not very helpful to young monks trying to learn Buddhism, because it's just too random. It's just too, it's not a coherent thing. So the Abhidharma is just a way of collecting all of these teachings and then just laying them out in a very straightforward way, and sort of throwing out all the story aspects and just sort of giving the doctrine. And so that's how the Abhidharma grew up, and eventually became, 1,000 years later, they had great universities, and and these philosophical things became very elaborate, especially when they were debating with Hindus and so forth. But essentially, so the Abhidharma you can think of as just Buddhist philosophies, but it's just a way. You can think of it also as just a way of sort of trying to lay out all of Buddhist teachings in just a simple, straightforward, sort of coherent format that's easier to teach. So anyway, those are the 3 forms. And so the first thing that happened after Buddha died is they got together and they collated all this and created all of these Buddhist texts, which were all oral at that time. Eventually, a few centuries later, people started using writing a lot, and then all of these things got written down. And in fact, if you ask, how do we know what the Buddha taught? Essentially, originally, how we know what the Buddha taught was this oral tradition that was passed down, and then eventually it was all written down. And so if you look at it from today, you can say, well, where does all this stuff sit? And in today's world, there's actually 3 or 4 sources of these. One collection, as I will explain, there's a group of people that went down to Sri Lanka about the 2nd or 3rd century BC. So the Buddha lived around the 5th century, and they brought with them a complete collection of all of these texts. And so we have a complete collection from these people. And these were written down in what's called the Pali language, which is sort of like, it's unclear whether it was a language that was made up just for these writing down these scriptures. It's something very similar to what the Buddha spoke, but they're not sure if it's exactly what the Buddha spoke. When the Buddha was alive, the Buddha taught in the local dialects. And where he was, there were slight variations in these dialects as you went from place to place. The Buddha, being very practical, always insisted that all Buddhist teachings always be given in the local language. I mean, there was this intellectual Sanskrit language, and you can think of the Pali as being sort of a watered down Sanskrit. So the Sanskrit is this really elaborate, very complex intellectual language, which was the intellectual background of India, even up into the modern day. And most of the deep philosophy and great literature of India a lot of it was written in Sanskrit, and it was universal all throughout all of India. But the Buddha would never teach in that because he wanted the ordinary people to be able to understand what he was speaking about. And in fact, when Buddhist monks wandered into other lands and gave teachings, they always asked Buddha, what language should I give the teachings in? And the Buddha always said, give them in the local language. So the Buddha was always practical. So this Pali is probably very similar. Some of it may be identical to what he said, but there wouldn't be much difference at any rate. So that's one collection of scriptures that we have. Another, as we will talk about in a little way, Buddhism got destroyed in India. So we don't have the scriptures from India. So we have to get them from other places. The other place where it went is eventually it got translated into Chinese. And we have a complete set of scriptures from China. A lot of it got translated into Tibetan. So we have a pretty complete group from Tibet. However, interestingly enough, the original 4 main bodies of sutras got lost in Tibet. So we don't have a Tibetan version of those. They were apparently transmitted, but in the early days of Buddhism sort of went up and down depending on who the king was. They seem to have gotten lost. So we don't have that. And recently I've learned that there's another thing sort of up in the northern part near Afghanistan, northern Pakistan, there was a country called Gandara, and some of the scriptures got preserved there. And because it's a dry area, some of these things were written down in wood bark and stuff, and they magically survived. There's been some recent archaeological digs that have recovered some of these things in the last 20 years. But the main sources really are the Pali and the Chinese. And in the West, it's really the Pali version that's dominated because it's very accessible, it's translated. A lot of Westerners went to Sri Lanka and so forth, and it got translated. And the Chinese was harder to get at. But about 20 years ago, they digitized it. And so now there's starting to become a lot more translations of the Chinese versions, which are nearly identical with the Pali, but there's little subtle differences. And sometimes people try to use those subtle differences to look for, textual corruption and stuff. Because all of this stuff had to be you have to keep writing it down. And the same way as the works of Aristotle could sometimes be distorted by scribes and stuff, screwing up their thing. You can have the same things happening here. So there has been, and sometimes, even, people scribes sometimes want to add little things of their own. So sometimes they also check some of these things to see if some things were added. And there's been some controversies because there are some misogynist comments in the sutras, but they think that those were added later by pious monks who, were all male and may have been worried about women and so forth. The monks always are. So they think some of the misogynist things really didn't have anything with the original Buddha. And Buddhism as a whole, the Buddha had many women followers, and many became enlightened, just like the males. Although, of course, ancient India, and probably very much like modern India, it was very misogynist, and it was hard to be women in ancient India. It's a very paternalistic society. And even modern India is a very paternalistic society. So there is that aspect of that's the environment that Buddha came from. But Buddha himself, from all of the things that I've read of his teachings, he had many women followers, and so he was not misogynist at all. Okay, so anyways, so after these original councils, then later on there were eventually other councils, but very quickly after the Buddha died, Buddhism split up into many sects, somewhere between 18 and 50. Some of that's geographical because people were sort of dispersed and communication was different. And so whoever was sort of the best religious leader of each group sort of did their thing. But the important thing in Buddhism for determining whether you have a sect or not was actually not philosophy, not belief, but it was the Vinaya. It's the rules you live by. The monks had to have a common set of rules that they always agreed to. And even in the Buddhist time, they always had these same battles that you see in religious groups now between the ultra strict people and the loosey-goosey people. So you've got the people who say, just follow the main idea and we're fine. And there's other people who are really strict literalists. No, we have these very exact, precise rules, and you have to follow them to the letter. And so there always were fights between these two sort of different views of monastic morality, if you like. And, and that's what seems to be the main battles. Later on, as we'll talk about, there was a new version of Buddhism called Mahayana Buddhism. And Mahayana Buddhism actually in many monastic communities coexisted with the earlier form of Buddhism, and they had no problems. Buddhism is not about what you believe, it's about how you live your life. And so that's the important thing. So having slightly different beliefs about how you interpret Buddhism is not the big deal. Although there will always be some people who worry about that. But anyway, in the earlier Buddhism, they had all these different sects, and eventually, they were dispersed over a large thing. There was no Pope of Buddhism, like I say. So they developed in different ways. And of course, over time, so originally Buddhism was all in India. And as time went along, it would gradually spread. In Buddhism, there is this thing about you're not supposed to proselytize. You're not supposed to go out and try to convert other people. If other people have the karma to be attracted to Buddhist teachings, then you certainly, welcome them and give you Buddhist teachings. But it's not about trying to go and convert people from other religions. So, but nonetheless, Buddhism gradually spread. The main place that it spread originally was to the south, to Sri Lanka, these islands off the south coast at the bottom of India, these big islands off the south coast. And that's where eventually what's known today as Theravadan Buddhism is. When the Mahayana Buddhists arose, they would call these people Hinayanists, which is slightly insulting. But these people in Sri Lanka itself like to call themselves Theravadins, the elder tradition, the elder teachings. And these Theravadins are the people who maintain this Pali canon. And they practice, I think, what is probably the closest form of Buddhism that's probably closest to what there was at the time of Buddha. So it's probably the closest form of that. In addition to going south, of course, it went north and it gradually spread. So that the earliest thing, this Theravadan version was probably around the 3rd century during the reign of Ashoka in India, is when that spread down. Later on around, well, first of all, let me tell you what happened to India. let me give you the full story of India before going to all this spreading around. What happened to India is Buddhism became very popular. It became a major religion. And some of the rulers, like King Ashoka, greatly supported Buddhism. And when you had rulers that supported Buddhism, then Buddhism became the main dominant religion. So in ancient India, whatever the ruler wanted to happen really made a big effect. But Buddhism was mainly, was very heavily, of course, it started in northern India, but it spread pretty much throughout all of India. And over time, you developed great Buddhist universities, if you like. The famous one, for example, was Nalanda. And very intense scholarly Buddhist philosophy developed at these great universities. And there were great many teachers that appeared at these universities. The other thing that happened was Mahayana Buddhism. And so the original Buddhism, so essentially Mahayana Buddhism evolved roughly around maybe 1st century BC, birth of Christ, 1st century AD, somewhere around that period. And we're going to discuss Mahayana Buddhism a lot more, because in today's world, Mahayana Buddhism is the dominant Buddhism that you find everywhere. So pretty much everywhere in the Buddhist world, everybody is a Mahayana Buddhist, except for these Theravadins in Sri Lanka and sort of around that area. Sort of also it's, in Cambodia and Thailand, down places like that. So sort of around the southern areas, you have this Theravada Buddhism, but almost everybody else became Mahayana Buddhists. And eventually I'll come back and explain what Mahayana Buddhism is. But for now, maybe the way to think about it is it's sort of adding a special emphasis on compassion. And eventually I'm going to have to explain that there's actually 2 forms of enlightenment. There's something called liberation, which is sort of what the original Buddha taught. And then there's becoming full enlightenment, which is becoming like what the Buddha was like. And even at the time of Buddha, the people realized that the Buddha was at a very higher level than the people who became liberated from samsara, which is what liberation is. But anyway, I will come to this eventually. But the goal of Mahayana Buddhists is for everyone to become fully enlightened Buddhas, for the benefit and to actually actively work for the enlightenment of all other sentient beings. But anyway, that will require, I don't want to say everything all at once. So I will come back and I will give a full, very detailed explanation of Mahayana Buddhism in subsequent teachings, not today. So anyway,
Mary has her hand up.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, speak, please. You turn on your microphone.
Yeah. So, in the United States, there are a lot of people that are, I don't know what they call themselves, but like the Insight Meditation Society and Jack Kornfield and
Yes.
Sharon Salzberg and all those people. And they say they do Vipassana, I think.
Yeah, Vipassana is the name they give to themselves.
And so that is that Mahayana or not?
No. That is,
okay.
They are all Theravadins.
Okay. Thank you.
So that's, that's the American, that's the main, thank you for saying that. That's the main American name for the Theravadins.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people, on the East Coast, on the West Coast.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean that is the, I mean that's a major form of American Buddhism, and so but those are all the Theravadins.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you for asking that, because these people go under different labels, but everybody else that you hear talk about, Zen and everybody else is, those people are all. Um, all the Zen and Tibetan, everybody else is Mahayanas.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, so that's important. So anyway, so in India, what happened is, Buddhism stayed around in India until sometime around 1100 to 1200 AD. And that's when Buddhism got wiped out in India. And prior to that time, Buddhism would go up and down depending on what the kings wanted. And there was always a battle between Buddhism and Hinduism. I mean, Hinduism is this vast thing, many different things, but particularly the people of the Vedas and so forth. There were two things that they didn't really like about Buddhism. One is that the Buddhists said that the caste system was nonsense, that what made a person a noble person was not who your parents were and whether they belonged to a high caste or not, but it depended on just whether you're a good person or not. And the other thing too is, of course, the Vedas in particular have all this animal sacrifice. And in Buddhism, we believe that animals are sentient beings like humans, and that you should not harm animals. And so the Buddha was against animal sacrifice. So the Hindus really didn't like this, and they pretty much actively were always fighting against Buddhism. And they had great debates where they tried to show that the Buddhists were philosophically wrong and so forth. But in the end, I mean, Buddhism was popular and Buddhism sort of held its own until this period around 1100, 1200. Muslims, people of Islam, huge armies of these people swept in from the north. And when they swept in, they essentially massacred everybody that would convert to Islam. And particularly, they massacred most of the Buddhists in the north. And they wiped out all of the major northern, these Nalanda and these big universities, killed all the monks, burned all the manuscripts. And that's why we don't have much textual transmission from ancient India. And at the same time, there are some indications that the Hindus were actually delighted by this because they sort of hoped that the Buddhists would go away anyway. But of course, eventually this is in modern times. This is why India is sort of today is half Muslim, half Hindu. The northern parts went to Pakistan when you had the Great Divide of India after World War II. You had the Muslim parts, Pakistan, and so forth, and then the rest of it, so it sort of got divided in half. But at any rate, so Buddhism actually, interestingly enough, totally, for the most part, small groups, but for all practical purposes, basically disappeared from India, its land of origin. Fortunately, though, for us, Buddhism had spread to other places. So Sri Lanka and these places still continue practicing their form of Buddhism to the day. So that's probably the longest continuous period from like the 3rd century BC up into the present day. But the other places where it spread to is, the other thing that people are very curious about is Tantric Buddhism or Vajrayana Buddhism. And that began to appear around 700 AD. And so but I will actually talk about Tantric or Vajrayana and what that is. And you should basically view it as just an additional Mahayana practice, is I think the best way to explain it. But I will go into detail more about what it means in the 4th class of this series. So anyway, we've got Buddhism wiped out. However, the other place that Buddhism spread to is most importantly into China. And that started very early on, I think around the birth of Christ, but it really there was a very heavy spread around 500 AD. And in China, there were actually a lot of different forms of Buddhism. So we associate certainly Zen Buddhism originated in China by a teacher, but they also have what they call Pure Land and I don't know, probably at least, 10 different schools or whatever, 10 different major schools. And then, of course, the way a lot of this happened is you'd get a very charismatic leader, and he would sort of transmit the practices that he felt especially beneficial. And so you would sort of, and then people would follow him very closely. And so you would get these sort of different forms of Buddhism again. All of them had the same Four Noble Truths as their core, but as Buddhism spread to other countries, Buddhism sort of would take on some of the coloring of the different country you would go to. So you'd take on in China, you would take on a Chinese coloring, and in Tibetan Buddhism, you would take on a Tibetan coloring. And so a lot of times, some of the practices that you get have a lot of cultural influence from whatever country that you're in. And I think that's natural, because that just makes it easier for people to feel comfortable practicing if they, if what they're practicing sort of conforms to their culture. And then, of course, from China, eventually Buddhism spread to Korea, maybe as early as the end of the 7th century AD, and then eventually to Japan by the late 12th century AD. And so in Japan, of course, Zen is very, very important in Korea, but again, in Korea, there's other forms of Buddhism as well. In Japan, there's other forms, but we tend to associate, I think, Zen Buddhism particularly with Japan, because that's sort of how it got transmitted to the West. And of course, Zen Buddhism was a big influence on Steve Jobs when he was making all of his iPhones and stuff. He loved Zen has this very simplistic, streamlined, absolutely beautiful architecture and so forth. And Zen is a very, at least the Japanese form is a very austere thing, huge emphasis on meditation and sitting for long periods of time in meditation. But anyway, Zen is very Buddhism. And there's large parts, a lot of Zen Buddhism in America, centers in San Francisco. There's a very large center in Santa Fe, very internationally known center of Zen Buddhism in Santa Fe, where they bring in a lot of guest lecturers and other things also. So in the United States, people know a lot about Zen Buddhism. And more recently, a lot of Tibetan Buddhism has come to the United States. But anyway, so that's the other place that Buddhism spread. Is it spread north into Nepal and then into Tibet. And so the first version in Tibet hit around 770 AD. Buddhists were invited to Tibet, and they basically converted the whole country. And then a little while later, there was another king who didn't like Buddhism and pretty much wiped it out. And then after that, it became more popular again, but since they had sort of lost their original teachers, it became a little bit corrupted. And then some of the later kings invited more Buddhist scholars from India to help sort of bring it back up to snuff again. And that happened around 1000 AD. And the person that was really, so Padmasambhava was the famous person who originally went to Tibet and converted it. The person who was famous around 1000 AD was a great Indian scholar called Atisha. And eventually in Tibet, 4 different schools or lineages developed. The original lineage that goes back to Padmasambhava is now known as the Nyingma religion in Tibetan. A little after Atisha showed up, both the Kagyu and Sakya lineages started up. The Sakya is a very scholarly form of Buddhism, and the Sakyas did a lot in translating Buddhism from Sanskrit into Tibetan. So they translated a lot of the scriptures and were heavily involved with that. The Kagyus were started by people like Marpa and Milarepa, and these were great meditators. And so the Kagyu version always has a heavy emphasis on lots and lots of meditation. And the Karmapa is the head of the Kagyu. So sometimes you'll hear about the Karmapa. The Gelugpa is the latecomer. That was started by Lama Tsongkhapa. You can think of roughly 1400 AD. And Lama Tsongkhapa was a great, again, a great reformer. He tried to reform, again, Buddhism had sort of become a little bit corrupted again. And so he lobbied very hard for celibacy among the monastics and things like that. But he also did a lot of sort of heavy philosophical work, writing a lot of texts where he sort of, again, sort of codified what all the great Indian philosophers had said, but sort of reset it again in Tibetan. And so he was a great emphasis among actually all four sects in Tibet. And the Gelugpa, again, because of the nature of Lama Tsongkhapa, is a very intellectual tradition, much like the Sakyas. And in today's world, the Gelugpa is by far the most dominant Tibetan. You know, it's like, I don't know exact numbers, but 2/3, 3/4 of all the people are Gelugpas. The Dalai Lama is ostensibly in name a Gelugpa, although he tries to be even-handed, because the other thing that happened is China invaded Tibet, and since 1949, the Tibetans have been, the only way you can practice Tibetan Buddhism is outside of Tibet. The Dalai Lama left Tibet, and of course the Dalai Lama, oh, you have a question, right? Yeah, go ahead and ask your question.
So I know that like in Mongolia, they also practice Tibetan Buddhism. Like,
Yes.
do the schools exist the same way over in Mongolia?
That I'm not sure. I do know that there are certainly Gelugpa monks that were in Mongolia. There's a famous monk, Geshe Wangyal, who was in New Jersey, who came from the Mongolian tradition, and he basically taught Gelugpa tradition, and he had a huge influence on Tibetan Buddhism, actually training a lot of people who really spread Tibetan Buddhism in the United States. But actually, I'm not sure exactly. Oh, let's see. Mary Jo raised her hand also. Mary Jo.
Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt the train of thought, but I've heard of this type of Buddhism that I don't know about, and it's called Bon, I think, B-O-N, maybe. Is
Yes.
that something also that is valid Buddhism?
Yeah, the Bon tradition, well, I mean, the thing to understand is that, you know, Tibet existed before Buddhism came to Tibet. And the original religion of Tibet was called Bon. So Bon was actually sort of pre-Buddhist, if you like. However, once Buddhism came to Tibet and basically really took over Tibet, there were sort of Buddhist versions of Bon that sort of developed. So it's not considered one of the four main lineages, but there are sort of people who do sort of practice a Tibetan Bon tradition where they sort of fuse the two traditions. And in fact, there's a lot of Bon in the other four traditions also, because it's part of their culture. I mean, the other interesting thing about the Tibetan people is before Buddhism came, they were known as an extremely warlike people. They were extremely aggressive, like some of the greatest fighters in Asia, and they were highly prized for their fighting abilities. So there is always this sort of aspect of aggression in Tibet. And it breaks that, you know, so Buddhism is very, you know, pacifist and, you know, love everybody. But, you know, it's hard to suppress this ancient warrior people. And so sometimes when these people debate each other, I'm often astonished at the words they use. Oh, you're a total idiot, fool, you know, nimwit. You know, sometimes in these debates, these people can be very strong. And I think it's sort of a remnant of their earlier warrior culture. And for them, it's no big deal, you know, they're just used to it. But to a Westerner, it sounds a little bit strong sometimes. So, but anyway, did I answer your question about Mongolia? I'm not, I guess I couldn't answer completely. I think it might be Gelugpa, but I'm not sure.
No, yeah, you did. Thank you.
Okay. So anyway, I mean, one of the benefits of the Gelugpa is that our center gives a lot of courses. And so you're benefiting from these Zoom classes because the Gelugpas tend to teach a lot. And it's actually very helpful because sometimes we also in our centers teach people from some of the other traditions. So we've taught people who are Sakyas, Zens, and other things. Because sometimes these other traditions are so focused on meditation that they don't tend to give a lot of classes. I mean, sometimes they do, but sometimes people come to us to get sort of the basic teachings and then go back to their original tradition. We've had a lot of Zen people, and actually, interesting, Santa Fe is this religious hotspot. I mean, Santa Fe is not such a large place, but it actually has all 4 Tibetan traditions. So there's a Nyingma center that's about, I don't know, about 3 blocks away from where I live. There's, our center, which is a Gelugpa tradition. There is a stupa in Santa Fe, which is the Kagyu tradition. And more recently, actually, the head of the Sakya order came to Santa Fe about 5 to 10 years ago, gave a big teaching in the main conference center in Santa Fe, and started a Sakya center. So now we have the Sakya center here also. Although the Sakyans are relatively, of the 4 sects, that might even be the smallest version. But anyway, so we have all 4, and we also have Zen. We also have crystal power and all sorts of things in Santa Fe. Everything you can imagine we have in Santa Fe. But anyway, so that's what the 4 Tibetan. And in general, I would say that from afar, if you look at the 4 Tibetan traditions, they're basically all Tibetan. They're all, from a Western point of view, they're almost the same. So they do have certain different tantric practices. So when you get to the higher levels, they do have some slightly different tantric practices. They do have, some of them like the Kagyu and Nyingma focus on meditation a lot. There are some separate practices that they do, but over the breadth of it, they, from our perspective, they seem very similar. It reminds me of Scandinavia, which I used to spend a lot of time in Scandinavia. You've got Danes and Swedes and Norwegians. They all fight amongst themselves and think they're terribly different. But from an American, they all look like Scandinavians. So it's sort of the same way in Tibetan Buddhism. Do you have another question, Eric? Go ahead.
So what makes a person affiliated with one's tradition versus another?
Well, if you were living in Tibet, probably it would be like the United States where you were born. It's like whatever your parents was, you would probably practice that thing. And different villages might have a monk from a different thing, monastery or whatever. And the United States, a lot of it depends maybe just on luck. If you're interested in Buddhism, you may just find a Tibetan center. And so whatever one you walk into, you tend to affiliate it. Of course, with Zoom and now, you actually have a lot of choice. You can actually, pick and choose. And in Santa Fe, there are people, I know many people who will wander from one Buddhist center to the other. They'll get some teachings here and they'll think, oh, maybe it's better over there. So they'll move over there. So, and of course, in America, you can go wherever you want. Most of the Tibetans say it's good not to do that so much. It's better to sort of find the one you resonate with and stick to it. But I, in my own personal, of course, everybody sort of wants you to join their group because we're all financially starving. All of these are small groups, and they would like your money to survive. but I would say, quite frankly, it doesn't matter. In fact, in my mind, the Mahayanas say it's important. I've always said it's important to be Mahayanas. But in my mind, the way Buddhism works is you should go wherever you resonate. And each of these things have different colorings. It's like, I have known some people in our tradition who say, there's not enough meditation in the Gelugpa. So they've gone over to maybe a Nyingma tradition because they want to emphasize meditation more. So they can be a personal choice that way, for example. Even though, I mean, there is meditation in all four groups, but I think it's just a question of emphasis. But I would say, we're all individuals. We all have our individual karma. We resonate with different things. And really taking the Buddha's original spirit of being a very practical person, you should ask yourself, what works best for me? What is going to help me on my particular spirit? Not that one is better than the other, but for me personally, which one seems to work best? What best accelerates my progress on the spiritual path? So I would say, look inside. It's good to try different things, maybe listen to different teachings, see what they say, and sort of just feel what really feels right in your heart, what feels comfortable, and go there. And I don't think you're ever stuck in any one tradition. If at a certain point you change and you develop, you may realize, you may say, oh, maybe I'm not getting enough teaching here. Maybe I should go to a Gelugpa center. Or, oh, for where I am now, I really need this meditation. And these other people really seem, So I would say I would not feel stuck in any one place. I would go to wherever you feel most comfortable, wherever you feel you gain the most spiritual benefit. So that's my own personal answer. Maybe I'll get fired from this teaching job for saying that, but but I think that is in the spirit of Buddhism is and there has been this tradition where people have said, if Catholicism works better for you, you should become a Catholic. There are some people who really feel the need to have a creator God looking over them. And some people from an emotional or psychological really feel that very strongly. So for them, to connect to something like a Christian tradition may work better for them, for where they are in their spiritual path. I mean, it is interesting too, because there is a, difference between Mahayana and Theravadan in the sense that in the Mahayana, you have real Buddhists that you pray to, like Tara, Avalokiteshvara, Manjushri, and so forth. Whereas in the Theravadan tradition, you don't do that. And so, and in fact, that may be the reason why Mahayana has become the most popular, because people feel like it's helpful to have Buddhas watching over you. Whereas other people feel like I want sort of a more abstract thing, more hardcore or whatever. And so they want to go back to closer to the original teachings of the Buddha. So they may go to the Theravadins. So it's all a personal choice. And I think, and again, I don't think you can make a mistake. You shouldn't get hung up about it. It's like people are always so worried, oh my God, if I make the wrong choice, I'm screwed forever. I think it really doesn't matter. If you have a good heart, if you're trying to lead a spiritual life, spiritual things will open up to you. You'll be led to the right place, is my own personal belief. It's like try to be just very open and relaxed and just go to where it feels right. And if you do that, I don't think you can make a mistake. That's my own personal opinion. And that's from, having done this for a little less than 20 years, watching all these different things, getting all these different teachings. Every year I get more relaxed about it. When I was first beginning, I was all hung up also. Oh my God, if I don't do this, I'll go to hell for 30 million years but as I've gone along, I've really relaxed more and more. And for me personally, I actually read a lot of the original Buddha sutras because I feel like listening to the original Buddha in his original words is very helpful. And to me, it's always been reassuring. And I think that's why I'm so relaxed about it now, is because listening to the original Buddha is very relaxed. It's like he focused on what was important, but he always chose this middle way. Don't go into extremes. Yeah, go ahead, Mary Jo. Did you have a question, or are you just your microphone is turned off?
I am sorry. So what are the books that you read? What are those sutra books, or are they called sutra books, or what else?
Okay, what they are is they're called the Nikayas. So this is one of the fattest ones. So you can see it's several inches wide. And this is called, they're often called discourses. They often translate this word. They're sometimes called sutras or discourses is the way I often translate sutras. And these are published, and the main ones are, there are 4 collections. There's the numerical discourses, the collected discourses, the long discourses, and the middle discourses.
Yeah.
And
I've heard of
these
some
are
of those.
published by Wisdom Publications in Boston. And one of the main person who's translated a lot of these, they've had various translators, but there's one guy called Bhikkhu Bodhi, Bhikkhu, which means monk in the Pali, and Bodhi, Bodhi, is his sort of last Pali name. I think he's actually American, but he lived in Sri Lanka for many years. Does wonderful translations. The other thing that's wonderful about it too is he has a huge collection of commentaries at the end of the sutras where he explains everything. And that's actually one thing I never understood, because I always thought that the these sutras were the main thing. But over these 2,500 years, of course, people wanted more teachings on them. So they would, originally you had oral. Oh yeah. Aaron is saying that there's some BDK publishing as some of the, you can get them. Oh, the Agama canon is actually the Chinese version. So it's not the Pali version. So the version I was talking about is the more easily accessible, but that's the Pali version. But the Agama is the same version, but it's the one that was translated into Chinese. And but at any rate, these things, you don't realize how big an oral tradition there was until you read the back of these sutra books, where and they would have, and originally all of the commentaries were all oral. Eventually they got written down in the commentaries. And then later on, people did sub-commentaries to the commentaries. They thought that even the commentaries didn't explain it well enough, so they had additional sub-commentaries to explain the commentaries. So there's a huge, vast literature of these things. But in the back of these sutras, it's very helpful, because there's this oral tradition that tells you things like the background. So you'll read a sutra. The Buddha went, he talked to this person, he gave this teaching. And you sort of wonder, well, who was this person that the Buddha gave the teaching to? Well, you look in the, in the footnotes at the back of the book, and they tell you exactly who this person is. And not only do they tell you who this person was, they tell you like the most important incidents in his life. And sometimes they'll even tell you whether he became enlightened or not. Or sometimes they just rogue, and sometimes they stop being monks. The commentaries are absolutely wonderful, and that's actually where you learn the most, is these footnotes in the back of these books. But the sutra stories are wonderful, because there's a lot of them I find even humorous. There are these great Brahmins, these young sort of Turk-like guys that are, think they're hot stuff, and they're really, they're like child prodigies, and they're brilliant, and they say, oh, who is this Buddha to talk against the Vedas? We're going to go debate him and just trash him, destroy him to pieces. And then they have the conversation that he has with the Buddha. And of course, these guys, half the time, they end up converting to Buddhism. In fact, there's some stories where successions of these guys go off to meet Buddha. So one young guy goes off, he gets converted, and they say, and the Hindus say, what happened? So they said, oh, well, he must not have been smart enough. So they send a second guy, and then he gets converted. So some of these stories are and there's huge numbers of similes too. The Buddha said basically that similes were so helpful in teaching to people. And so sometimes some of these sutras are even labeled by the main simile. So it's like I mentioned there's a simile of the arrow, where I mentioned in the first class, where somebody gets shot by an arrow. And, when you get shot by an arrow and you're wounded, you focus on healing. You don't focus on, philosophical things like what, did the feathers come from which bird, or what kind of wood was made, you focus on healing yourself. And that simile was Buddha said, I came here to stop your suffering. And that's what I focused on. I didn't come here to teach you philosophy. The Buddha also said, he said, he get another simile that the Buddha gave, which is a wonderful one. They were in this forest, and of course, billions of trees all over the place. You can imagine the jungles of India. And the Buddha said, look at all the leaves and all of these trees. He says, imagine that's what I know. What I'm teaching you is this single leaf. So anyway, there's another famous analogy is the Buddha talked about Dharma, the teachings. And the Buddha said, imagine that you're in a dangerous place on one shore. There's a river. You build a raft, use that raft to get across to the other side where it's safe. He says, what do you do with the raft when that happens? He says, basically, you just throw it away. You don't need it anymore. And the Buddha said, that's the way the Dharma is. I created this Dharma for you to get to the other safe shore. And once you get there, you don't have to worry about it. You can throw it away. So anyway, there's just huge numbers of similes and so forth. So the sutras I enjoy reading the sutras. And again, too, there's a lot, most of what we know about Buddha's life is also enclosed in the sutras, and where he talked about it. But, there is some deep philosophy. There are some things some of his teachings are difficult to understand in the sutras, but you can just skip over those and just read the biographical parts, or the parts that have these amusing stories between the different people. So anyway, but anyway, for me personally, I've always greatly enjoyed the sutras. Okay, so we've actually we've hit our 8:30 time. I should stop. So I didn't quite get into the Four Noble Truths, but I think this background is actually useful to people. It gives you a broader view of how the whole thing works. Because most of the time you go into center and you focus on their narrow specific teachings. And sometimes you think that that's the whole Buddhist world, and you don't see this whole broader range of what Buddhism really is, especially as it's spread all the way over the world. Okay, so let me first ask, are there any more additional questions about what I've talked about? If you think about something between now and next week, you can also ask next week also. You can save up your questions and ask them. The whole purpose of this course actually is mainly to answer your questions, in my point of view. Because it's when you ask questions is where I think you learn the most. So absolutely feel free to ask millions of questions. And somehow I'll fit the rest of the course around your questions. And
thank you.
Okay. And so next week we will continue. So next week we're going to launch into the Four Noble Truths, the main teaching, the heart of all Buddhist teachings. And then from there we'll eventually spread to all of the other main teachings, and difference between liberation, samsara, karma, a lot of these other main teachings. What does rebirth mean in Buddhism? Which means different than what most people think. So a lot of these sort of core teachings is what we're going to try to get into next time. And then eventually we'll try to hit the Mahayana teachings on bodhicitta, which is the core teaching on the Mahayana teaching. And then at the end, we'll try to get into it a little bit. What is Tantra and Vajrayana? And is that a separate thing? That's not, it's part of the Mahayana path, sort of a higher level of Mahayana path. But we'll keep going like that. And feel free to collect any questions you have about Buddhism. And I hope to see you next week. I enjoyed having you here. Thank you for coming.